So, here's a quick synopsis of the war in the Pacific at a glance, a newspaper glance, that is. The date that would live in infamy set us on a course to war after the Pacific Fleet was devastated by the mastermind's attack of Isoroku Yamamoto. But the United States would come back with a wrath, as FDR said, to ensure that this form of treachery, this dastardly attack, this form of treachery shall never endanger us again. And the quest for vengeance had begun. And Isoroku Yamamoto predicted, "I fear that all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." That resolve would be a while in coming, but by May of 1942, the U.S. Navy, the Battle of Coral Sea, a major turning point and the first of a series of ongoing defeats of the Japanese Navy, devastated, put a big dent into the foe. After the Battle of Midway, the United States Navy continued devastating the Japanese fleet. After the Coral Sea battle, and then after the Midway defeat, the miracle at Midway, the Japanese Navy would never again be on the offensive, and it was only a matter of time before they lost all of the various Pacific islands that they held. The Philippines would be a major stepping stone, and MacArthur would eventually, as he promised, return to the Philippines. But it was a defeat of the Japanese army at the Battle of Guadalcanal that marked the first time that the Japanese ground forces had ever been defeated in battle. That paved the way for the island-hopping progress to eventually allow MacArthur to retake the Philippines, the next stop after which would be Iwo Jima. That devastating battle and that crushing defeat of the Japanese, who essentially refused to surrender at any cost, who lost 22,000 soldiers in the course of that 3-day nightmare, were then faced with doom. Then it was on to Okinawa, and the U.S., with vengeance still fresh in its memory, even years later, 4 years almost after Pearl Harbor, had not forgotten December 7th. We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. Remember, Pearl Harbor was a war cry, a motto for the United States. We'd invaded Saipan, one of the Pacific atolls, on the way up to the march towards the Japanese homeland. You can see here New Guinea, which was essentially the battle that followed Guadalcanal, the Philippines, and then moving into the perimeter of the Japanese homeland. Japan had been relentlessly firebombed by B-29 super fortresses starting in June 15, 1944, after America had retaken the Philippines and could use it as an air base, and then could use Iwo Jima as an air base, especially an emergency landing base for our bomber planes that had been damaged during their firebombings of every major industrial city in Japan. Tokyo alone, during this year and several months of bombing before the atomic bomb, lost over 1 million people and was essentially erased from the face of Japan. But that wouldn't bring about Japanese surrender. What it would take was not one, but two of what Truman described of the most terrible weapon ever devised in human history. Not one, but 2 atomic bombs before Japan would finally capitulate to unconditional surrender. And VJ Day, peace, would again be restored to the Pacific. Japan was called upon by the Potsdam Declaration to surrender unconditionally. Part of the debate with respect to whether or not the United States should have used atomic weapons outside of international law and whether it was militarily necessary or not, was whether the United States' unconditional surrender demand in fact paved the way, made necessary the use of the bomb. Could the United States have achieved peace through a conditional surrender, a negotiated surrender with Japan? That is the essence of this third and most important part of your debate.